United Nations headquarters, which was built in 1945 and financed largely by John D. Rockefeller. Inside UN headquarters is an ominous meditation room. The custodian of the meditation room is Lucis Trust Company. At one time, the Lucis Trust was located at 666 United Nations Plaza and was formerly named Lucifer Publishing Company. The Rockefeller-funded UN meditation room is 33 feet long and 18 feet wide. 18 feet is 6 plus 6 plus 6. The small, dimly lit, windowless room was built in the shape of a pyramid that is laying on its side. At the center of the room is a 4-foot-high, black, casket-shaped stone slab which weighs 6.5 tons and is extremely magnetic and rests on a concrete pillar. The pillar descends beneath the floor into the bedrock and taps into the Earth's hyperdimensional energies to induce a state of altered consciousness. Not far from the meditation room is the United Nations Security Council chamber. This is the emergency room of the UN, where the world leaders meet when there is a threat to peace. They decide the fate of nations. Notice the giant mural that towers over the Security Council room. The central focus of the UN mural is the phoenix bird that has risen. The phoenix bird is a symbol of Lucifer. Egyptians believed that the phoenix symbolized a god who rose to heaven in the form of a morning star like Lucifer after his fire immolation of death and rebirth. Notice that the phoenix bird is not standing above his own ashes. He is standing above his old skin. Like a snake, he has shed his old skin and is revealing himself as God at the center of the mural. At the top left, there is a church steeple without a cross. The missing cross symbolizes the death of Christianity. Below, a woman receives the rays of the sun god, while the man in front of her plays Pan's flute. To their right are two pyramid symbols and people joined together by a long blue serpent-like cloth. Below the risen phoenix, a sword is driven through a dragon beast. This represents the killing of old beliefs and religions that depicted Lucifer as a beast. The New World religion worships him as beautiful. Behind the phoenix, the ghostly figures of the walking dead are stepping into a void. They symbolize depopulation. On the right panel, the pale horse from the book of Revelation is the bringer of death to humanity through weapons, hunger, and disease. The man is releasing him. The chained black man represents slavery, while the top panel of the mural shows a technologically advanced white race who control industry, art, and science.
The worldwide activities of the Lucis Trust, founded by Alison Foster Bailey, is dedicated to establishing human relations by promoting the education of the human mind towards recognition and practice of the spiritual principles and values upon which a stable and interdependent world society may be based. Like Alice Bailey, Sarah McKechnie is taking her professional and spiritual journey through life with her husband, Dale McKechnie, who is Vice President of the Lucis Trust. Sarah McKechnie, I can only imagine that you've been asked thousands of times to speak on the history of Lucis Trust founder Alice Bailey. But before I ask you to do this, I would like you to reach farther back into history and give us an overview of Alice Bailey's Russian mentor, Madame Helena Blavatsky, and why Bailey looked to her for inspiration.
Madame Blavatski, as she's called, or sometimes referred to as HPB, her initials, was a real pioneer in the bringing of what's called the ageless wisdom to the West. The ageless wisdom is a term for the spiritual teaching that for most of human history was hidden or veiled, but it's like a golden thread that runs throughout the world religions and mythologies and has always been present in human consciousness in some form or another appropriate for the time. Then in about 1875, a Russian woman, Madame Blavatsky, who had traveled extensively throughout the East and studied with spiritual teachers who were in remote locations in Tibet, in Egypt, deep in South America. She traveled all over, which was extraordinary for a woman in those times, wrote a work that's called The Secret Doctrine, and it was really fundamental in bringing the ageless wisdom into Western consciousness. Alice Bailey herself discovered the secret doctrine when she was living in California. Her own personal story is very interesting. She was a divorced woman with 3 small daughters to raise, and through a series of extraordinary events, she discovered the secret doctrine and was put in touch with 2 students who had studied personally under Madame Blavatsky. And so Alice Bailey became deeply engrossed in the study of the ageless wisdom and became an expert on the secret doctrine and began to teach it herself. So yes, you're right, Blavatsky was in many ways Alice Bailey's mentor, even though they never knew each other.
Is it true that Blavatsky's writings might have been plagiarized or at the very least served to inspire the recent best-selling book, The Secret?
I don't know. I am not terribly familiar with that book. I've heard of it. I think that some of the principles in the book The Secret are fairly well-anchored ideas that are really part of the ageless wisdom and therefore part of the library that humanity has been given. I wouldn't use the word plagiarized, which suggests stolen, just rephrased for modern man.
So let me read something Blavatsky wrote. Quote, "It is Satan who is the god of our planet and the only god, and this without any elusive metaphor to its wickedness and depravity." Do you know what this really means, and do you think Bailey was so inspired by this sentiment that she named what has now been renamed or rebranded as the Lucis Trust, the Lucifer Publishing Company, back in the 1920s?
If I understand the statement of Blavatsky about Satan, that's another term for Saturn, which is one of the planets. In the study of esoteric astrology, there are, I believe, 7 sacred planets. Saturn is the planet that is connected with the distribution or the working out of karma, the law of karma, which is really just another term for the law of cause and effect. It's utterly benign in its ultimate working out, even though karma can be painful to the individual undergoing the process. And that's why Blavatsky said Satan or Saturn is, well, how did you put it?
It is Satan who is the god of our planet and the only god, and this without any elusive metaphor to its wickedness and depravity.
Well, if I understand her language, without any elusive metaphor to its wickedness and depravity, she's saying it's not necessarily associated with wickedness and depravity as we normally think of Satan, the devil. Saturn is the planet of karma, which is the great law of equilibrium, the restoration of harmony and balance. That's another way to look at cause and effect. It's the restoration of equilibrium, which can only be good. So Alice and Foster Bailey came out of the theosophical tradition, as I said. I believe Foster even was the editor of a theosophical magazine that they called Lucifer. So they probably thought Lucifer, light bearer, was a good name for their fledgling publishing company when they started to publish the books that Alice Bailey was writing, the books they saw as bringing light to humanity. But within 2 or 3 years, they decided to change the name of the company to Lucis Publishing Company. Lucis being from the same Latin term meaning of light, trust of light, publishing company of light, and that's the name we've had since about 1925.
Lucis Trust is a non-governmental organization that has an affiliation with the UN.
I mentioned Aleister Crowley. We're going to talk about him more now. This guy wrote very copiously, but this is the most pertinent thing. He said there are beings of intelligence and power far beyond, of a far higher quality than anything we conceive of as human. They are not necessarily based on the cerebral and nervous structures that we know, and that the one and only chance for mankind to advance as a whole is for individuals to make contact with such beings. So he was a poet, a mountain climber, and he could play 8 chess games blindfolded and win. He was also the leading ceremonial magician of his day and a Luciferian. He got this book, which is called Liber Alvel Legis. In English it means the Book of the Law, and this is like the holy book of the Crowleyan religion. The religion is called Thelema, which is the Greek word for will, and it's cardinal, just like, you know, like in Judaism you have the Shema, you know, Deuteronomy 6:4, and in Christianity we have the Golden Rule. Well, the total thing of Thelema was, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, love is the law, love under will. And he believed this was the beginning of a new age. He thought that the Christian religion was part of the aeon of Osiris, who was a slain and risen God, and that now it was going away, and that the new age would be the aeon of the crown and conquering child. And this was in 1904. Well, anyway, next slide. The deities that are talked about in this book are called Nuit, Hadit, and Rehur Kuit. And Nuit is a star goddess, Hadit is like her consort, and Rehur Kuit is the hawk-headed god of war. He's often known as Horus, if you're familiar with Egyptian mythology. And Crowley was one of the first magicians to openly talk about gods from other planets or galaxies. In the course of what he was doing, he did what was called the Amalantra working. Next slide. In January through March of 1918, he did one of these very, very elaborate ceremonial magical workings in Central Park West of New York City. And at least one intelligence was brought into physical manifestation. In other words, this being appeared via a magical portal that they opened. They believe they opened the very fabric of space and time and allowed this being to come through. And this is a portrait by Crowley taken from life of what this being looked like. Next slide. Does that look a little familiar? I mean, it's really, the eyes are a little different, but it's very, very similar to the classic gray, you know, alien. This entity identified itself as Lam, L-A-M. Next slide. And this is stuff this guy is Aleister Crowley's successor, Kenneth Grant. Crowley died in 1947, and he is now the outer head of the order of the OTO, which is an occult order, Ordo Templi Orientis, that Crowley was made the head of. And according to him, Lam is a link between the star systems of Sirius and Andromeda. Lam is the gateway to the void. Notice that. It's number 71, and that's in Gematria, which is the Hebrew numbering system, is 71. That's the number of no thing. Lam is a great old one whose countenance is recognizable in all accounts of UFO occupants. Lam has been invoked to fulfill the work set afoot by Aiwass as a reflex of Aiwass. Now, Aiwass is the being that dictated the Book of the Law. He's supposedly like the John the Baptist of the new aeon. Aiwass is a spirit. He's not a human being. Excuse me, next slide. Now, 1 year before Crowley died, and oddly enough, he died in 1947, the year of the Roswell crash, 2 of his disciples, L. Ron Hubbard and Jack Parsons. Have you heard of L. Ron Hubbard? The guy that founded Dianetics and Scientology. Anyway, they decided they were going to try and carry this thing further. And they did what was called the Babylon working in 1946 January. And again, this is right before the birth of the flying saucer with Kenneth Arnold and the Roswell crash just a year before that. They did a further magical working, and they called it the Babylon working. And the purpose of this was in fact to invoke the Scarlet Woman, who was supposed to be the consort of the beast. Next slide. They opened the portal wider, and they wanted these extra cosmic intelligences as influences to enter this known universe more freely. And what seems to have happened, they believe, is that they accomplished a drastic enlargement of ripping open of an existing magical portal and then not being able to close it again. And perhaps the rip they created was not possible to close. And it really caused a lot of catastrophic things, the most obvious of which is that Jack Parsons, he's the guy that founded the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He was a rocket scientist, and just a few weeks after this, he was blown to bits in a jet fuel explosion in his laboratory. But see, this is powerful, dangerous stuff. Don't let anybody tell you that magic isn't real. It is. It's just that it doesn't come from where magicians think it comes from. They believe it comes from within themselves or from these external entities. Actually, it comes from the demonic realm, and it's totally deceptive. Okay, next slide. Today, some Crowleyite OTO-type groups believe that attracting this LAM consciousness is the best way of facilitating the growth of the Lucifer gnosis in human evolution. Now, I think you heard Michael before talk about gnosis and Gnostics. That basically means knowledge. Gnostics are people that believe you're saved by secret knowledge. And so what they're saying here is that if you want to achieve the knowledge of Lucifer, you need to get in touch with this LAM consciousness.
Jack Parsons' life story was the very epitome of faith and destiny, as if he himself was subject to some hidden hand or powerful daemon that was guiding his own life towards specific locations, events, and individuals. He eventually took the Parsons along with John's sisters Frances to a ceremony known as the Gnostic Mass at the Church of Thelema underneath the famous Hollywood sign. The Gnostic Mass itself is highly theatrical and ritualized in a manner similar to the Catholic Latin Mass, even down to the sanctification and consumption of a Eucharist. Along with this, the Gnostic Mass outlines the rite of crossing the abyss and encountering the Egyptian goddess Nut. There are also invocations of the crowned and conquered child of the new Aeon, venerations of the pagan god Pan, as well as prayers directed towards the sun, chaos, air, Babylon, Baphomet, and all this being amalgamated into what at the time would have been considered a spectacular act of heresy, and one which left a deep impression upon both Jack Parsons and his wife Helen. As Parsons' interest in the work and writings of Aleister Crowley deepened, specifically in terms of the nature and application of ritual magic, and also being somewhat a man of science, he came to believe that the magical events and occurrences contained within the work of Crowley and other sorcerers could be explained within the field of quantum theory. Parsons' now Frater Tupan, which also resolved itself into 210 within Kabbalistic numerology, soon proved himself to be an influential and inspiring figure within the Agape Lodge. So much so that Smith, in his letters to Aleister Crowley, declared Jack Parsons of a superior intellect to anyone else within the lodge, and even some went as far as proposing that Parsons become the natural successor to Aleister Crowley as the future head of the OTO. Even Crowley himself was equally impressed with Parsons from reports and correspondences forwarded to him, eventually coming to realize that Jack Parsons was the most important Thelemite within the entire order. Along with his success within the world of magic and his personal spiritual development, Parsons' career and research into rocketry was likewise taking off. Funding from the US Army Air Corps to develop a small rocket motor to propel aircraft off short runways resulted in the Jet Assisted Takeoff, or JATO project, being developed. Literally the first ever rocket research program directly endorsed and funded by the US government. In July 1941, the Galsit JATO team, now having switched to liquid fuel rockets, were ready for their prototype testing. After the final technical issues were solved by Frank Molina, an A-20A plane at the Muroc Auxiliary Airfield in the Mojave Desert fired its attached rocket and shot off at high speed into the blue sky. The test was a resounding success, impressing both the Suicide Squad themselves and the military. This led to the US Army Air Corps ordering 60 JATO liquid-fueled rocket motors. This in turn led to the formation of the Aerojet Corporation with the intention of producing rockets capable of reaching outer space. At last, Jack Parsons now had so much he had desired for in life: a stable financial income for him and Helen, a successful business, respect as a government rocket scientist, and something of an extended family within the Agape Lodge. Despite objections from some lodge members that Parsons was not fit for purpose of leading the community due to his drug taking and womanizing, Crowley nonetheless appointed Jack Parsons as acting head of the Agape Lodge. Following the end of the Second World War, former science fiction writer L. Ron Hubbard found returning to civilian life extremely challenging, his family life dissolving, although he did continue to support them financially, and he was also beset with various illnesses and debilitating conditions, having been in and out of military hospitals, while surviving by means of government disability payments, as he was unable to recommence his career as a writer. Hubbard found himself at the door of the Agape Lodge in Pasadena, initially to live in his trailer outside the mansion, but when one of the tenants vacated, Hubbard then found himself living inside the parsonage proper. During this time, Hubbard had also become fascinated with Thelema and the prospect of ritual magic, as Hubbard proved himself to have a complex understanding of the magical tradition from his own personal research. The future founder of the Church of Scientology was very eager to take part in the real thing. This delighted Jack Parsons no end, as Hubbard was the magical collaborator which he had been looking for. Regardless of his hurt, Frater Tupan was determined to move beyond his emotional state in order to embark upon the Babylon working with Hubbard in the role as Parsons' scribe. Despite having no formal magical training, Parsons was also acutely aware that Hubbard was a natural magician and considered him ideal for the purpose. Both Hubbard and Parsons also came to believe that a powerful guardian angel referred to as the Empress was protecting and guiding Hubbard, now named Frater H, and which had led him to the Agape Lodge so as to assist Jack Parsons in the completion of the Babylon working. As the harnessing of sexual energy was central to the commencement of the Babylon working itself, Parsons needed someone who would be unfazed by his masturbating in front of them, so as to attain magical visions from the working, while Hubbard was to write these visions and events down. Not surprisingly, such magical operations also tend to come with spiritual and psychological risks. As reality is literally changed in real time, the subatomic field is torn asunder, and doors and gates are flung open to other astral realms and altered states of consciousness. In effect, Parsons and Hubbard were creating a new system of magic outside the rigid structures of pre-existing ceremonial magical systems, and Crowley's concerns may have been as much driven by jealousy and insecurity as by his fears for the safety of the two men's souls. Between January 4th and onto the 15th, 1946, the initial Babylon working began. Right from the start, Parsons made rudimentary mistakes within the ritual process. Parsons' own psychic state had also been altered somewhat by his delving into traditional witchcraft and voodoo. There was also increasingly negative paranormal and spiritual activity in the parsonage, which Smith and the rest of the Agape Lodge were deeply concerned about, even going as far as contacting Crowley in London in a state of extreme agitation and depression concerning what was unfolding inside the lodge, as well as how it was affecting Smith and the other lodge members. This included significant and sudden changes to the local weather in Pasadena directly above the Agape Lodge building, as well as ghostly orbs and other mysterious voices calling out to residents in strange languages. Ed Foreman was terrorized at one point by a screaming banshee howling outside the parsonage, and the experience left him with a profound effect which haunted him for the rest of his life. Following this, there are also complex salutations and venerations to various angelic beings, gods, the elements and the cardinal points. The closing of the ritual includes the acts of banishing, which are as complex and thorough as the opening rites. For every magical door that is unlocked, it must be locked again by turning the same key in the opposite direction. On January 15th, the ritual was completed. Almost immediately, Parsons expressed great disappointment and tremendous despondency as to why the ritual had seemingly failed. A few days later, as a kind of after-ritual pilgrimage, Parsons and Hubbard went deep into the Mojave Desert, and as the sun was setting, a kind of peace came over Parsons, and he announced to Hubbard that the ritual had been a great success. Then something truly incredible happened. Parsons was correct. The ritual had been a success. The elemental Babylon goddess had, incredibly, at the same moment when Parsons and Hubbard were watching the setting sun over the Mojave Desert, knocked upon the front door of the Agape Lodge in Pasadena. In the immediate aftermath following the Babylon working, with the mysterious phenomena of the ghost rocket hysteria in Scandinavia, which began in the middle of the Babylon working itself, followed by waves of UFO activity in North America, the Puget Sound and Roswell events, leading to thousands of others, that Parsons and Hubbard may have actually torn the fabric of space-time asunder. It is also worth noting that the US space program, particularly the Apollo lunar missions, which were a result of Jack Parsons' rocketry workings, were also connected to strange anomalies and UFO sightings reported by the astronauts themselves. When Aleister Crowley found out about the Babylon working, he was infuriated, referring to Parsons and Hubbard as idiotic louts. Again, once more, this may have been a result of Crowley's insecurity that they were developing a new system of magic beyond Thelema that was getting powerful results and would then go on to generate enormous social and cultural changes, which in time Hubbard and Parsons most certainly achieved. 15 years later, on the evening of June 15, 1952, the quiet streets around Pasadena were rocked by a loud bang. This was followed by a second bang, which was more clearly identifiable as an explosion. Jack Parsons was rushed to Huntington Memorial Hospital, where he died less than an hour later. His last words were reported to have been, "I wasn't done." The police soon determined that there was no proof of foul play and that Jack Parsons had been killed when he accidentally dropped the coffee can containing fulminate of mercury onto the floor, and which had exploded as he was trying to catch it before it hit the ground. In the end, the cause and reason for Jack Parsons' death were soon lost in the brief media sensationalism, which swirled around his occultic beliefs and his necromancy. In no time, the media interest eventually died down, and Parsons' widow and friends were left to deal with the aftermath. Perhaps the most sympathetic and fitting tribute was paid by Aerojet, the company he had founded, who in an official statement said, "Jack Parsons, he liked to wander, but he was one of the top men in the field." The OTO held a Gnostic Mass in his honour, while a private prayer service was held at the Pasadena crematorium. Marjorie took his ashes to the location in the Mojave Desert where the Babylon working had taken place, and Jack Parsons, the brilliant, still young rocket scientist who was instrumental in developing the discoveries and inventions which would eventually lead to the creation of NASA and the Apollo moon program, was scattered into the eternity of the desert wind